speaker will be Marina Kaneti, and she'll be speaking about the persistence of memory, Belt and Road, and emerging maritime discourse in South Asia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to the organizers and to Ian for convening us here today. I think this is a very important forum. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes? Okay. I think this is a very important forum and very much needed conversation. I want to start with a warning. I think some people will be upset because I will not talk about economics. I apologize in advance for that. Persistence of memory, Belt and Road, and the emerging discourses in Southeast Asia. What I want to talk to you today about is my ongoing research project, and I will tell you what my key questions are, how am I situating my research and this memory narrative that I will talk to you about, and some of my preliminary findings. The key questions that I'm trying to look at is there a sense of common past along the Silk Road? Are there alternative narratives that we can talk about? And how is the past important in different local contexts? And I also want to say that throughout my presentation, there are a lot of images. Because of lack of time, I will not spend as much time on the images as I would like to, but I'm, of course, happy to talk about this in the Q&A session. The other thing that I want to point, kind of making an exception here, while the microphone is getting fixed, and I'm buying myself some time, sorry, no problem, is this is an exhibit, I don't know if you're familiar with it, that just opened in the National Museum in Beijing. It's called Creating a Common Future, and it features artifacts from 13 museums that are collaborating with the Chinese government and with the National Museum on putting together a vision for the common future based on the past. So, situating a memory narrative. As you, I believe, are familiar with, in 2013, when President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, he immediately framed it as part of an ongoing narrative, something that is linked to the Silk Roads. And he said that the Belt and Road will emulate the spirit of trade and cooperation of the Silk Road, and pretty much in, I believe, 3/4 of his speeches ever since then, he always mentions and references the Silk Road, talking about peace and cooperation, mutual learning, mutual benefit, win-win situations that have occurred in the past that he wants to recreate with the Belt and Road Initiative. One more recent reiteration of this, and this is again coming from this exhibit that I just mentioned at the National Museum, is that the Belt and Road encapsulates the wisdom of the Chinese people to extend the splendid history of the Silk Road and create a brighter future. The last thing that I want to mention here is this background here is from a musical that is currently playing in Xi'an. It's called The Legend of the Camel Bell. And to those of you who are familiar with Xi Jinping's speeches, in 2013, when he launched the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the first things that he said was that he remembers, or he can think of, the camel caravans because he can hear the camel bells. And lo and behold, 2 years later, there was a musical around the memory of camel bells. A little bit more on the Silk Road, and again, I might be repeating some of the things that Ian was talking about as well. The Silk Road as a term is a geopolitical term. It's not something that existed actually in the past, and I think it's extremely important to remember that, and you will see why as I go along with this presentation. it is a metaphor for millennia-old encounters, but it's a metaphor that exists only from the 19th century. So there could be various reasons why people in the past, although they were certainly connected and certainly engaged in various exchanges, chose not to think of this as one entity, right? One common road. And the other aspect of this, which is really important, is that there is a lot of creativity in the way in which people understood their connections with each other and the way in which they use those connections for their own advantage. And this is not necessarily just from the perspective of empires or kingdoms or city-states. The other thing that I want to mention briefly as I'm situating my research here is the role of museums. Museums are or have always been implicated as messengers of the state, as the ones that provide us with the view from the state and constructing narratives that are state narratives, national narratives, usually also compartmentalizing or categorizing minority issues or ethnic issues in a very particular way. However, I would like to argue also that in the current environment, and particularly with this push that I'm arguing for in the Belt and Road Initiative to connect to the Silk Road, museums are starting to play a different role. This is definitely very visible in China, where a lot of money goes into refurbishing or creating new exhibits around the Silk Road, and gradually I think it's extending into other countries as well. A little bit about the research that I have been able, or the sites that I have been able to visit so far. There are quite a few in China, and because for the current moment I'm focusing mostly on the maritime connection, I have started looking in museums in Indonesia, Singapore and Malaysia, and in India, and also mostly looking at the maritime museums along the Chinese coast. So some of my preliminary findings. And this is, again, speaking to these questions that I raised in the beginning of my presentation. Is there a common Silk Road narrative? Are there alternative narratives? When you go across museums, there is definitely a heroic narrative coming from various different exhibits. And although there are different heroes and different stories, this person, General Zheng He, and a lot of other names that he has depending on where you look for him, is present in a lot of these exhibits. Sometimes there are exhibits that are only about Zheng He. There are times when it's only just one paragraph kind of hidden behind a lot of other things, but he's present in most of these exhibits. And I have to qualify this here that a lot of these exhibits are not sponsored by the Chinese government. So you cannot say that, or they precede the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's not necessarily something that the Chinese government is doing right now. The theme of trade, circulation, and flows is everywhere. And again, it is not a Belt and Road trade and circulation and flows, but there is a consistent theme of trade and circulation and flows. Usually, artifacts are used to define the trade and circulation. This here being the Belitung excavation, which is currently housed in Singapore. Not currently, forever housed in Singapore. There is also the Maritime Legacy. So irrespective of where you go, people do try to formulate a maritime legacy within the narrative of a nation state, although of course this maritime legacy exceeds the nation state as such. A lot of the exhibits also map borderless world, or a world that again exceeds the maritime, exceeds the state. Here in this map, you do see the boundaries of the state, but in a lot of the other maps, you don't see anything that is even close to a state, and there are no names of states. And again, I'll return to this towards the end of my presentation. And then there is a whole world beyond trade, right? So trade is very central to pretty much all the exhibits that I have visited, but a lot of exhibits don't talk about trade or don't make trade the predominant narrative, which is also why I think it's important to think about both the Belt and Road and the Silk Road and what the Chinese are trying to create today beyond the narrative of trade. Not that it's not important, but there is much more to it. One of the most obvious narratives that occurs everywhere is religion. And again, I'll be happy to talk about how different museums talk about certain religions but not others, but there is definitely a conversation about circulation of religion. There is, in some museums, also a narrative of resistance and a narrative of violence, something, again, that is very much lost in the conversation of the Silk Road that the Chinese are trying to create, or in anything related to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I just want to point to the scary person here. Does anybody know who that is? No. So this is, actually there was a whole group of people, the Kunjali Marakars, I'm probably mispronouncing their names, off the coast of Kerala, who were tasked with resisting the Portuguese. So within the local history of Kerala, this is a very powerful moment of the identity of Kerala. But beyond that, we don't know anything about it. Even more interesting is this one. This comes from the Maritime Museum in Jakarta. And this is Laksamana Malahayati, again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, who stabs a Dutch explorer in the head. And this is something that all the school kids see every day. The general Malahayati was one of the Aceh women generals who was, again, fighting against the Portuguese in this case. So again, a very, very important local narratives that are lost when we are talking about either the Silk Road or the Belt and Road Initiative. Another aspect that appears in some places but not in others is, for example, the fact that the circulation and exchanges also involved arts and music and dancing, something that I suspect Xi Jinping wants to recreate with all the different events that he's staging across the world. And again, I'm happy to talk about that at the end. The other aspect that is not very visible is the messiness of trade. So this is kind of outside the museum where traders actually trade. That does not enter the exhibit space. So just some concluding remarks, and here I'm returning to my title, Persistence of Memory, and of course the Salvador Dali painting where I borrowed the title from. How do we think about time? How do we think about the past? What is the role of the past in the present? And what is the role of memory in recreating our understanding of the past? One thing that I would like to say here is that memory has a lot of force because it reminds us things from the past that we need to do in the present and in the future. So this is also something that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership are talking on a constant basis when they're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a creation of a common future. And that creation of a common future is very much linked to a memory of the past that they're currently creating. And so part of what they're trying to do is create a common identity, which is a common identity around a common past. And Ian talked about certain types of pasts that could have been part of the narrative, and they're not part of a narrative about the common identity that the Belt and Road creates. So there is a danger a little bit, from at least from what I have seen, for universal idea of a memory of the Silk Road. That universal idea is taking certain events from the past and making them universal for all of us to think about. However, one of the beautiful things about this idea of the Silk Road is that it's not only Chinese. Everyone who, in one way or another, was part of that Silk Road can create a counter memory or a counter narrative, or can inform in a conversation with the Chinese what a different version of the Belt and Road and the Silk Road connection could be. Just to add one more thing here, in creating that Silk Road, Belt Road connection, there are a lot of places that enter on the map, but there are a lot of other places that don't. I assume this is a bell that I should finish. Okay. And so the question then becomes, who gets to be part of the map, and how and why, and who will be creating that memory for us. So thank you, and hello, Asia.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts at this networking session. So my presentation basically will talk about domestic impact of BRI for recipient countries looking at Sri Lanka. This is also not a completed research, so it's some preliminary thoughts. So Sri Lanka was one of the first countries who extended its support and joined hands with Beijing when it declared Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. China has initiated multiple infrastructure projects in the island, and the projects are promoted as bringing numerous economic and development opportunities for the country. However, with the 99-year lease of Hambantota Port, Sri Lanka is turned into a classic case where idea of common prosperity has failed. So my presentation will look into the economic, political and other aspects of the BRI project, and I'm also trying to see whether can you solely say that the BRI projects are the reason for those whatever that's failed, or whether there are any other reasons domestically that require attention. So Sri Lanka's relations with China dates back to the ancient Silk Road. I think Sri Lanka is one of the part of the narrative of the ancient Silk Road. There are archaeological evidences, and this narrative did not come just after the new Silk Road. It has been there for a long period of time when Sri Lanka teaches its history as well. So, however, during the post-independence, Sri Lanka was one of the first countries to recognize communist China, but the relationship was not as strong as it was today, as what we see after 2014, to be exact. China was not a regular donor, as you can see. It's only 2% of entire Sri Lanka's foreign aid in the year of 2013 that China provided. So it was in 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. China provided a significant amount as humanitarian aid, but this completely changed from after 2005. This is due to several changes, I think domestically as well as internationally. Internationally, we see that China gained a lot of attention from early 2000s as for its speed economic development, and it has been recognized as a challenger for US hegemony. And then there's also Indian Ocean, which comes to focus as geopolitical center for the 21st century. During this time, Sri Lanka was fighting a war against the LTTE, and in 2005, President Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa becomes the president in country. So he decides that the military victory could be the only solution against the terrorism. So he decides to go for a military operation, which does not get widespread acceptance in the international community. So we see that from between 2004 and during this period, there is a decline of Sri Lanka's traditional donors providing foreign aid to the island nation. So after the end of the war, Sri Lanka was in need of massive investment for economic and infrastructure development, but as I said, does not get the support from its traditional donors. So China was more than happy to comply with Sri Lanka's need. So from 2009 onwards, we see a spike in aid provided by China for this period. And then we see a series of projects from 2009, out of which everything is under loans except two projects which are grants, for a sports project in Jaffna and another refurbishment of a superior court complex. The rest it comes as loans. But the government decides to go ahead with the loans during this period. And then we see in 2013, China declares its ambition to initiate Belt and Road Initiative, and Sri Lanka sees this as an opportunity to improve its economic status, precisely to enhance its infrastructure in order to boost development. It was right in time for Sri Lanka to step in line with their initiative, so in order to make up for the lost years for the war. So in my opinion, this is because BRI vision and priorities compiled with Sri Lanka's interests at the time. So BRI prioritized facilitating connectivity and financial integration and unimpeded trade, which will provide infrastructure in roads, ports, airports, and so on and so forth. So the government, especially Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa, when he became the president again in 2010, emphasized on making Sri Lanka a naval hub, aviation hub, commercial hub, energy and knowledge hub, basically to make Sri Lanka a hub in the Indian Ocean. So, but there's a problem for Sri Lanka because it did not have enough infrastructure to attract investment for this. So Sri Lanka needed investment. Chinese investment was ready there, so it went ahead with investment. And this investment requirement did not change even after 2015, even though during the election period the UMP government was adamant that it will not continue with the Chinese projects. It really could not realize that when they actually came into power, because they did not get the financial support for infrastructure as it required, so it had to continue with the Chinese infrastructure. So basically these are the main projects that comes under BRI, so Hambantota Port, Mattala Airport and Colombo Port City. However, only Colombo Port City is the only project that is officially declared as a BRI project. Hambantota Port commenced in 2008 and its first phase was completed and opened in 2010. Total estimated construction cost was for the first phase 1 was US dollars 361 million, out of which 85% was funded by Exim Bank of PRC. The first phase of the project provided bunkering facilities, ship repair, shipbuilding and crew change facilities. Since it began construction, it gained widespread local and international attention and also criticism. It was alleged as a white elephant project of the former president. After starting operation, it did not immediately pick up for business, which resulted in inability to generate income. And in 2016, the current government leased 80% of the project through a debt-free equity swap to China Merchant Ports Holdings. Mattala Airport was built as the second international airport, and it's also gained same kind of criticism, and today it is not operating and clearly a failed project under the loans taken from China. And Colombo Port City is still in construction. The construction was set to begin in March 2011, but due to several circumstances it was postponed, and that was launched on 17 September 2014 when President Xi Jinping came for a visit to Sri Lanka. So when these projects were one of the key discussion points during the election campaign running from 2014, late 2014 until the presidential election in 2015, and the current government, which was in the opposition at the time, was adamant that they will not continue with the Colombo Port City. However, after they came into power, it was halted for a period of time, again started in August 2016 through a tri-party agreement which involved Chinese companies, Sri Lanka Port Authority and Megapolis Department of Sri Lanka. So what are the domestic impacts of these projects for Sri Lanka? There are both, I cannot say there are always negative impacts, there are positive impacts as well. So these projects provided much needed infrastructure for the country, and it also generated employment for the local community. So it helped Sri Lanka gain foreign exchange reserve. There was construction boom, boosting tourism, boosting real estate after these projects were launched in Sri Lanka. However, we cannot ignore the fact that foreign labor coming to Sri Lanka, especially from China, going to be a major issue which will not keep all the foreign reserve expected to come into the country, especially when it once the Colombo Port City is started operation, there is doubt whether Sri Lankans will get employment inside, because as of now we don't see there is any plan of the government to generate the skills that would require from a financial city of this scale. So if that happens, it will not actually provide the amount of employment that it is being promising to the people. And then there's foreign debt, obviously because of major infrastructure projects there is mounting foreign debt. The current foreign debt cannot be only compiled for China, like China is not the only reason. There are other many other past financial loans that have been taken and yet to pay as well, but China also play a crucial part at this moment. Then on political side, the projects provided Sri Lanka the ability to strengthen its foreign relationship with China, and through which it has also got diplomatic support when it is required. And also, as it's been observed throughout since 2008 up to now, the Chinese investments in Sri Lanka has provided the political leaders of the country to promise some infrastructure development, and then actually they have been able to physically deliver them. However, on the other hand, there has been mounting domestic political unrest because of these projects, which are associated mostly with the socio-cultural impact of these projects. For instance, these political unrest are with regard to increased corruption, displacement, land disposition, loss of livelihood for farmers and fishing community, because especially in Hambantota, where the airport and other projects are happening, they are farmers' lands, and also fishing community has lost their livelihood in Colombo as well, and there's a threat to the fishing community near Negombo area due to Colombo port city. And then obviously environmental impact of these projects, impact on marine biology, biodiversity loss, and so on and so forth. Especially in the case of Marthala Airport, where they have built this airport in a wildlife sanctuary, it has affected the wildlife movement. That is one of the reasons why airport has been failed to operate in this area. So in Sri Lanka case of failed common prosperity, Sri Lanka is taken as an example of failed case, especially because of Hambantota port. When China Merchant Port took over operation of Hambantota through a 99-year lease. So it's been highlighted that China is using economic support to other countries to and then successfully harnessing the most notable elements of its growing power. And through these economic resources, China promotes economic development for lesser developed countries. By doing so, least developed economies has become largely dependent on China for their continuous economic growth. However, China, these projects cannot, the failure of the projects do not solely the responsibility of China or the BRI initiative, in my opinion, because of the lapses identified in planning, infrastructure projects, prioritizing and implementation. Soon after the end of the war, what the Mahinda Rajapaksa government wanted, promised for the people is a boost in development. So he saw that providing infrastructure would help, and that was his justification. And Hambantota, especially being his electorate, he was much more enthusiastic about doing the projects in Hambantota. So rather than developing the area which will support operation of a port or airport, he immediately built the port and the airport. So the order of priority in developing the area was completely unacceptable. And also when it comes to Marthala Airport, we see that there is lack of proper environmental impact assessment done, because it is quite obvious that if airport is built in a wildlife sanctuary, obviously that is not going to, it will not be able to operate smoothly. Okay, so and then also inadequate assessment of socio-economic need of people, because when the people were relocated from the areas due to these mega development projects, one of their key concerns are how they are going to go ahead with their livelihood. Most of these people were farmers or fishermen, so alternative livelihood has not been provided properly. So in summary, China's increasing engagement with Sri Lanka did not begin just after BRI, it was way before that, and some of these projects were already operating in Sri Lanka when, by the time China officially intended its BRI project. BRI is a political and economic conceived achieving long-term international and political objectives for China. For Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka becoming a classic case of failed common prosperity is not purely a result of the projects, but also a failed policy decision and implementation. Thank you.
So please, gentlemen behind the suit, and then go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Yes,
I have the. Well, thanks for the two wonderful presentations. Very, very balanced. I have one question for each of the speakers. For the first speaker, the question is: does the past really matter for the building of the modern One Belt and One Road? I have often heard people saying that China does not have ownership over the ancient Belt and Road, and it's not a Chinese thing. So very much the ancient Silk Road does not have much to do with China, what China is doing today, which I kind of agree, because the Belt and Road today is mainly about connectivity, about trade and investment, right? So and of course to a lesser extent about culture. Then whether the BRI countries share a common past does not really matter, right? Especially when the BRI has been extended to, let's say, Latin America and Africa and maybe someday even North America. For those with those regions, China does not share a common past at all. So the question is essentially: is the past really that important? My question to the second speaker is not an academic question. It's a question about a fact. I'm not sure whether you know. I heard from different sources that the port of Hanban was actually imposed on China. So China didn't want it because there are no other ways for Sri Lanka to pay back the Chinese debt. So the Chinese had to take it. It's not something initiated by China, not something demanded by China, although China has to take the blame for being a new colonial power, and some of my colleagues in the law school they already draw an analogy between this and the British. So China's forced the transfer of Hong Kong to the British, right? So as example of part of the unequal treaties today, and in this time, China is the colonial power which bullies other countries. So but you don't have to answer it. I'm not sure whether that's true, whether it's imposed on China or China demanded. Thanks.
So why don't we collect a couple of questions? That way it's more efficient. Yes. Okay.
Thank you for two excellent presentations. My question to the first speaker is, thank you for raising a very important point, which is that connectivity in the 19th century came to be defined differently. I mean, basically what we are talking about BRI is connectivity. But how do you define that connectivity? In the 19th century, it came to be defined as the Silk Road. But this was not just a term. It meant the power relations between different countries which were being connected changed. The hegemony was in Europe. And the whole emphasis was on what the other countries, what Asian countries were providing to Europe. So Asian countries were providing resources to Europe. So the question then is, today, we are not in the 19th century, and I think colonialism is a bad example, excuse me, Chair, to sort of structure relations in the present. And the second point is that BRI certainly draws on the past because of the Silk Road, which you yourself said. the Silk Road, the UNESCO Silk Road World Heritage nomination, which is headed by China, is a transnational nomination. So, there isn't, today we are looking beyond the nation state. We're not looking at hegemony, we're not looking at power relations, we're not looking at core areas. So that was my question to you, and if I may just ask a brief question to the second speaker. I've heard this often enough, in South Asia. It failed because of lack of implementation, or the fact that, local people were not able to understand these grand designs. My specific question is, when we are looking at structures which are to be universalized, most often these structures are not developed in countries of South Asia, and but are instead imposed. So I think when we are looking at failed local implementation, there's much more to be thought about than just, oh, this didn't happen, or somewhere else we failed. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take one more question back here.
Hi, I also have two questions, one for Marina and one for Chulanee. First, Marina, your presentation your presentation on museums and sort of the construction of memory is really a way of legitimizing, right? This construction of memory as legitimizing the enterprise. So, and in a way, a soft power construction to buttress the hard power endeavor that's going on. So those two presentations went together quite nicely, but I'm wondering how you see this Belt and Road construction, and along with it that soft power angle of legitimizing a deeper shared history, the construction of that narrative as going hand in hand with the other side, the hard power side. My question to Chulanee is about the Sri Lankan case study. China, of course, as you mentioned and showed in your graph, was not is not the only donor. In fact, it's not the largest donor, in fact, in terms of the debt owed in Sri Lanka. But none of the other bilateral donors converted the debt into equity, right? So that's the issue with the Sri Lankan case. And my question there is, what can other countries learn? In the past, heavily indebted countries which could not pay back their loans came together to reschedule their debt, right? The Paris Club Agreement to reschedule debt, etc. That's when you have World Bank and other institutions that come together. In bilateral debt, in the case of China, what possibilities are there for countries like Sri Lanka if they should choose to default on their debt, for example? Thanks.
Let's take these questions and then we'll go for another round.
Okay. Maybe I need to grab the mic. Okay. Thank you for excellent questions. I'll try to answer all of them together, but if you're unhappy with my answers, I'll expand on them. First, starting with, does the past matter? I think this is a very important question, and if we look at countries around the world, history is a subject that is gradually disappearing from academic departments, and so probably a lot of people will say history doesn't matter anymore. I can spend the whole day telling you how much I disagree with a statement like this, or with a statement that the past doesn't matter. But let me answer the question in a different way. If the past didn't matter, then why would 75% of Xi Jinping's speeches talk about the past? So it's not just the fact that I, as an academic, think that the past should matter, or that there are people who believe that past occurrences inform our understanding of the present, or that there are people who think that there are things that have happened in the past that we need to remember so that they're not repeated. It's also the active integration by the Chinese government of an idea of the past that they want to bring into their understanding of the present. So it's a very active reconstruction of how past, present, and future work together. And it's a very active ideological, political project. It's not something that is just casually happens because Silk Road sounds nice and because it's something that we associate with adventures. There is a very active ideology behind it. And to kind of jump into the next question, which is about the transnational iteration of the Silk Road, I absolutely think that there is an attempt here to create a post-national identity. Not the type of post-national identity that you see with the European Union. It is definitely a different type of post-national identity. And then the question becomes, does that community that is supposed to be part of this post-national identity, of this new transnational community, does it recognize the same parts of their shared past, the way that Europe with the European Union has to recognize a certain history of Europe? And we know whether or not the European, I mean, we can talk about the European project a lot, but here again, you see a project of creating a common identity. I just came back from China where there was the Asian Connectivity Forum, right? The first Asian Connectivity Forum, New Asian Identity. And of course, you're right, there were a lot of people who were not Chinese there at the forum. But there is an attempt to create a common identity. And the question of soft power and hard power, how do these things connect? It's a very important question. My sense so far is that soft power is going separate from hard power. So it's not the case that wherever China is implementing an infrastructure project, it's also a place where it connects some soft power, museums or cultural exhibits and things like that. Actually, it really goes off on its own because it tries to, again, if this is a project to create a new sense of identity, that definitely goes way beyond what infrastructure projects can do. Because again, it has to integrate the community that sees a shared future, a shared past and a shared future.
Chulanee?
Thank you for the questions. I'll first answer the second one, then the first one, and finally Rani's question. So, your question about whether these structures were imposed on Sri Lanka, from my understanding and my knowledge, Hambantota as an area development has always been in the agenda since late 1980s. Because Hambantota is one of the least developed areas in the country, and it is where two of the main civil unrests happened in 1971 and then later 1983. So that was mainly due to poverty. So Hambantota was all that main idea about Hambantota developing as a port city and developing Hambantota port was always there. That structure was always there. And also, according to Sri Lanka Port Authority's information, Sri Lanka always, for a long period of time, Sri Lanka has this blueprint of developing multiple ports because the government believes that port economy is one of the key areas Sri Lanka has to develop because it's an island nation country. So that is its way of economic development. When I said that the fail in implementation is the failure in prioritizing how the project should have been happening, because the idea of Hambantota port was that it will provide cargo services for the agriculture products and other sort of different products in the area. It will provide business development for the area and so on and so forth. So sorry, during the period of war, Sri Lanka did not prioritize on these things because most of the attention was on security at that time. So soon after the war, when there was more opportunity for economic development, what Sri Lanka immediately did was building the infrastructure rather than before building whatever the other businesses and other supporting sectors that would feed development, feed smooth operation of port. That goes to the airport as well. Whether it's tourism, whether it's supporting the migration community of the area, that they did not provide the other supporting infrastructure. Even so, basically, because Hambantota was President Rajapaksa's electorate, he went ahead with showing off this big project rather than providing the other supporting projects initially, which would have contributed to the success of the projects. Even so they did not implement it as it was planned over a period of time. And whether port was imposed on China, I don't think so, because from my understanding and from what I gathered over my field research during a couple of months ago, there was always the idea of for a public-private partnership and a joint operation with China Merchant Ports, because China Merchant Ports also operate one of the terminals in the Colombo port, southern terminal, and they have a lease for 35 years. So what changed in this particular agreement was the time period that went for 99 years and also the equity share, because in this new arrangement, China has it's not only operating the port as a port, but also it operates the port services, which is not happening in Colombo Port City. So that connects me to the other question, like what are the possibilities out there? What were the possibilities out there? So before thinking of the possibilities, I would like to remind about the background as to how this built up to this situation. So as I mentioned in my presentation also, Chinese projects were one of the key aspects in the election campaign. So soon after this government came into power, they immediately stopped, and they stopped all the Chinese projects, and there were a lot of public criticism against China, and up to a level where there was public shaming as well. And so at one point, Chinese ambassador has to make an official statement and said to the media in Sri Lanka that if our loan is, if we are that bad, then don't come and ask for money behind doors. So it built up to that level of diplomatic tension. So I'm sure at that, when your relationship goes downhill to that extent, you have very little room for a negotiation when you're going to go for a negotiation with the same country that you have been criticizing for a long period of time publicly. Because I think what government thought was, because they were ready to stop Chinese funding and there will be multiple donors who are ready to pour money in Sri Lanka for whatever the projects and whatever the needs that they want to do. But that actually did not happen, and that for instance, they went on and said that the Volkswagen is going to invest in Sri Lanka. They sometimes name particular organizations and investors, but in reality that did not happen. And they use these examples and criticize China, so the relationship broke. So there was no much room for Sri Lanka at that point when it actually went to the negotiation table. So I think as a result of that possibility of a better negotiation, Sri Lanka failed at that. So, and other possibilities could have been negotiating with going for a multi-party investment in Hambantota, because for instance, even in Colombo port, there are multiple investors who are operating the terminal. Some are joint, some are government Sri Lankan only, and when southern terminal was first when China started operating it, the Colombo southern terminal, initially there was another. It was a joint investment between China Merchant Port and Aitken Spencer. Only after a period of time, Aitken Spencer sold its shares to China Merchant Ports. But due to the issues, I'm sure they must have China did not want to go for any share because they knew that they have much more room for negotiation. And right now they have been able to pick up business there. There are ro-ro operations happening and so on and so forth. So because of its own shipping network. So I think it was partly a result of a bad diplomatic relationship between Sri Lanka and China.
All right. We're running up to time, so if I see a few hands up, can we get some really short questions and really short answers? So why don't we move down from here? Maybe front. Short, please. Short, please.
I have a question to the second speaker. So recently, just 3-4 days back, Japan, India and Sri Lanka came up with a joint program to construct the East Container Terminal of the Colombo port. And so I'm just wondering, what will the implications of this be? Because this is going to be in direct competition with the Hambantota port. So I just wanted to know your views on that.
Thank you. The gentleman behind you.
Two quick questions to Dr. Kaneti first. Your use of the persistence of memory was remarkably evocative. I think it evoked a remarkably evocative theme. It alludes to the pliability of memory. You've seen the exhibitions in Beijing and elsewhere. If you start off from even the city-states, Genoa, Venice, and you travel further east, do you find any measure of congruence or incongruence in the narratives that emerge? And my second question is to Dr. Attanayake. I couldn't help thinking of the Marshall Plan, as you were talking about, and that raises the importance of domestic conditions in defining articulating the host country's ability to absorb resources. So are there any lessons that emerge from that? Thank you.
The lady in the back.
I have a question for the first speaker. You were talking about memory, and memory, of course, is highly selective. And so my question to you is about a selection. So first of all, how have you selected the museums you went to? So a part on methodology here, and also the alternative narratives you were talking about. I would be interested in how you selected them and what you think they really show for the BRI. Thank you.
All right, the gentleman in front of you. I'll try to collect this. Please be short, and then we'll get an answer together.
Okay, I'll try.
No, please don't try to make it short.
Chulanee, I suspect there's something more structural going on. You showed us a graph where we saw the peak of availability of, I think, cheap loans to Sri Lanka from 2008 to 2015. There was a spike and then an end, right? Which neatly overlaps with the global abundance of currency. So I suspect that because it's in the wake of the global economic crisis, 2008, what happened in the wake of the global crisis with the availability of global currency is the cheap loans, which really draw the economies of the developing countries, which focus mostly on construction, which then ended up leaving them high and dry when the cash began to drain with the Fed, increasing the rates. So, and because China's BRI is focused on trade-centered growth, and it is less about growth on the basis of high productivity sectors, is that there is something maybe structural going on with Chinese investments, that it is bound to leave these countries high and dry when the global winds are not in their favor. So I wondered if you could reflect on that.
Right, the lady next to you.
Hi, thank you for those very great presentations. My question is kind of related to what you asked about alternate state narratives. It's for the first speaker, and you showed us a map where you have pointed to places that you have been and visited those museums. I'm just wondering about the state narratives. How do they really build up? I mean, do they feed into this entire BRI narrative, or do they stand out as something very separate? And are they kind of related to sort of investments that they are going in? So it's also related to the issue that you raised about the differences between soft power and hard power. I mean, how would you like to address that? Thank you.
All right, Minjiang, and then the gentleman behind that. The gentleman.
My question is very short. The second speaker, what is happening to the piece of land that has been leased to the Chinese company for 99 years? This small piece of land next to Border Port. Is there any facility being built, any activity, any investment going on there? Thanks.
All right, and finally the gentleman behind.
Hello, I'm Wenqi Liao from the U.S. Department of Real Estate. Just a comment, quick, and make it quick. So Columbus project, it has two perspectives. China's perspective, I think it's just optimizing its interest, so there is nothing wrong. I think the more interesting question is Sri Lanka's perspective. Why do they want that gigantic project? Because at the outset, people might think it's like snake swallow an elephant, something like that. But I think to give it a fair account, my feel is that failed common prosperity, that statement might be a little bit strong, and you might want to think about it, because from Sri Lanka's perspective, we should understand why it wants that infrastructure. After 2005, the end of Civil War, the economy developed very fast, and next step, they have to attract FDI according to World Bank suggestions. And so they need to have better infrastructure in Colombo, the capital cities. But the central city is full of slums, historical reason, full of slums, and it's democratic countries. So it's hard to remove that slums. So one idea is build like land reclamation. And for that project, if you got a chance to see the commercials, because the CEO of that project.
Sorry, you have a question.
Right. So that project is envisioned of Singapore actually. So it's just like we start building Marina Bay Sands area, then reclamation back in 1970. So there is a lot of similarity. But it's just Columbus that one.
Sorry, do you have a question?
Yeah. I have a comment. I just have a comment. But Columbus, that one is kind of because its funding is from other countries. That's probably the risk. Right. So that's my comment. But perhaps you like to think a little bit about the urban planning issues of Colombo cities. And then
thank you. 2 minutes each. 2 minutes each. Sorry, we're running out of time. So pick what you want, and then we can have the conversation outside, which is part of what this whole network is thinking about. I'm sorry, it's just that
Okay.
I'm not controlling time well.
On the question of congruence and incongruence, actually, perhaps the best place to talk about that would be the exhibit at the National Museum in Beijing, where there are 13 museums that brought in pieces that technically should have been part of the vision of these museums in these countries for a common future. There is no one narrative. It's actually quite bizarre. And I thought about it a lot, and I thought that actually this is the way in which you bring in community together and allow a community to recognize what it wants from its past in order to have a conversation for how that holds into the future. Whether that's correct or not, I don't know. And my second minute is for my selection. I intentionally focused on maritime museums, so I only, for the moment, except for the National Museum in Beijing, I only go to maritime museums, or what in English is translated as a maritime museum, to see what type of narratives about the maritime connections emerge from there. And no, there is no congruence in the narratives, other than that there was trade and exchange.
About Colombo East terminal, like for that Japan, India and Sri Lanka is going for a joint operation. In Colombo port there are multiple terminals, and this is like the latest one. And China is also operating one with the Sri Lanka Port Authority. It's a joint arrangement. So I think it will only increase the competition between their shipping networks, because these are private shipping networks. China Merchant Port has its own shipping network, so what they would do is they will come only to that particular terminal most of the time, which means that, and so if there are any goods to be transshipped between to any other country within the terminals, then they will be transshipped between the terminals. So it will definitely increase and boost the transshipment in Colombo port. And export processing zone, to my knowledge, not the entire export processing zone is given for China. There are other, it's only one area, and recently there's a Singaporean Oman investment proposal for an oil refinery in the area. So it's happening there. About Marshall Plan, domestic, I have not looked at it and compared the aspect, but thank you for the idea. I'll look into that. And again, about the cheap loans, I agree with you, that could be one of the reasons, but it also coincides with the diplomatic problems Sri Lanka faced soon after the war, where many of its traditional donors, including Japan, Japan was Sri Lanka's highest bilateral donor, they pulled out, leaking human rights violation and so on and so forth.
All right, thank you. I really encourage everyone to put up the questions that you felt were unanswered to our speakers during our break. We have about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for the next session. So let's thank our speakers. See you all back.